Hello and welcome to Varn Blog, and today we're talking to Ross Wolfe on a series of pieces he wrote for the New International, which I believe are kind of consolidations and concentrations of a very long piece that you wrote a while back on Domenico Losurdo, or specifically against Domenico Losurdo, focusing on well, actually, it's hard to say exactly all that you focus on, but it starts with a critique of the Western Marxism book, goes through a little bit of his stuff about Stalin, and then you talk about his book on Hegel's philosophy of right, which I'm glad you noticed, because I have said this too, is a almost anti-Marxist text, which I think most people don't tend to internalize. That I know there's going to be people responding to that pretty strongly, but I wanted to ask you, because back when you and I first met each other, I think so over like 14 years ago, you interviewed Domenico Losurdo for and on his liberalism book, which was kind of the rage in the early teens. And I wanted to ask you, like, at the time, I did not see Losurdo becoming like a calling card for any faction of the American left. Even the Marxist-Leninist faction were not particularly spouting the kinds of lines he spouts at that time. Why do you think he became so popular?
Yeah, so it's a great question. In fact, like going back through everything, I discovered that you were actually the person who brought Lacerda's work to my attention. I think it was January 2012. And yeah, his book on liberalism, I think it was in the works then. It had maybe just been published. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and he came to give a talk at the Left Forum in New York. And so I interviewed him as part of that, focusing on the liberalism book. But yeah, it really, made a lot of waves at the time and had this kind of broad-based left appeal, I think, having been picked up by, the big publishing house on the left, which was and remains Verso. Um, he had a couple other books that already were out by then. He had his book on Heidegger and his study of Hegel, focusing on the philosophy of right. But the liberalism book was kind of like that's where he came to the attention of a lot of leftists, I would say. And at the time, like, I think the views he espoused in that book were, I think, had a broader base appeal to leftists rather than leftists of a particular stripe, particularly a Marxist-Leninist stripe. I think that really only became clear as further of his books were translated. I, fairly early on, because his book on Stalin already had come out in Italian and had been translated into Portuguese, I believe. I became aware that he, was a fairly well-known apologist for Stalin and his regime. Um, but really, that only, became clear over the course of the next like 10 years. And really, because Verso continued to publish several of his books, I believe they published his book on revisionism under the title of War and Revolution. And then long forthcoming only came out in the last few years, the massive tome that he wrote against Nietzsche. Um, it became clear, like, especially, as further of his articles and interviews came out, partially the interview that I had, and as well as with others, translations of his other interviews, that he was really a Dengist. Like
Mm-hmm.
and on that basis, he became championed by thinkers associated with the website Red Sails and this figure Gabriel Rockhill, his student Colin Bodale, who are part of the critical theory workshop. So yeah, whereas
Yeah.
he had this, like, I would say, larger appeal that was less like discriminate, he has since like especially since Verso has shut down the idea of publishing the book on Stalin. That was published by this press Iskra, which is explicitly Marxist-Leninist. And now the Western Marxism book having been taken up by Monthly Review, which is continuing to publish Rockhill, who's like one of his main promoters now. I foresee probably some of Lacerda's books continuing to be published by Monthly Review, which has always had, and I try to spell this out in the piece, a more positive appraisal of actually existing socialism than, let's say, Verso and New Left Review, the journal on which it's based.
Although I would say the flavor of that defense of actually existing socialism has shifted over the past 20 years. I mean, they flirted with much more standard Maoism, third worldism, all kinds of things have come through Monthly Review's doors. And this particular Dengism is interesting to me because I think one of the things we have to deal with is like, why was things like Red Sails so popular when Maoists, like when you and I met each other, the predominant forms of Maoists were like the RCP, Bob Avakian's people, the split off from the split off from the RCP of the Kasama Project, various traditional Maoist parties that were like remnants of 70s parties, like the various progressive labor parties, and then like
FRSO.
the monkeys, then the monkey fascist heaven people who became the LLCO, the Third Worldists. You know what wasn't very popular was Dengism, like particularly in 2012. And that kind of leads a question is, why has that form of Marxist-Leninism become so dominant that when someone calls them a Marxist-Leninist, I kind of just assume they're a Dengist and they actually don't know that much about Stalin. Like, you know, like you know, when I remind them, like, even Stalin thought that you had to eventually get rid of markets in the state, like, you know, like why do you think that is?
I mean, part of it might have to do with Xi and Xi Jinping's sort of embrace of the Marxist heritage of the PRC in a way that his predecessors, especially after the death of Deng, you know, had kind of let the Marxism of the People's Republic fall by the wayside. The anti-corruption campaign that Xi led was seen as like, you know, harkening back to the roots of Mao's Marxism-Leninism. Yeah, it really was not sexy in the early 2010s. Like people really didn't care that much about PRC. It was largely, there was a general consensus that that socialism with Chinese characteristics was in fact just socialism with capitalist characteristics, especially with the market reforms of Deng. And in fact, the Monthly Review Press largely mirrored that. You know, Monthly Review, again, it has a long history. It actually predates the New Left, going back to 1949. But it was, you know, had a very positive appraisal of the USSR, despite people like Paul Baran's distaste for Stalin personally. Baran is a very interesting figure who actually has like biographical connections with the Frankfurt School, but he had studied in the U.S. He was from the Russian Empire, having been born in 1910. But he studied with Preobrazhensky, and who was a major left oppositionist. Had a lot of his university friends killed by Stalin from the early 30s, but nevertheless maintained this kind of he viewed it as having played this heroic role, which, you know, in fact it did in the struggle against fascism. I would say that that was largely despite Stalin, but nevertheless, after the Sino-Soviet split, the Monthly Review School tended to side with the Chinese side in that split. Several of its major economists, like Charles Bettelheim and, of course, Samir Amin, were Maoists of various stripes. But and Paul Sweezy, who was the editor-in-chief, the co-founder of it, you know, was an enthusiast of China up through the end of the Gang of Four. but having seen it gone down what he thought of as the capitalist road. So really, it's a very recent shift back towards more uh, positive appreciation of the People's Republic. And in fact, I mean, there was an editorial on the new Cold War, and that where the Monthly Review editors tried to sort of chart the back and forth that their magazine has had on the issue of China. I view the decision to publish Losurdo, whose Dengism is very well publicized, as part of its consolidation towards a pro-China stance.
Yeah, I mean, I will say that in general, I think most of the left today is more defensive towards China than, I mean, I would even say this about myself. But at the same time, I have been taken aback by some claims made by Western scholars for China that even Chinese Mao supporters would not validate. So for example, like when I had Deng Ping-han on my show, I mean, he still spits venom about Mao. I mean, not about Mao, about Deng and Mao's leaving the nothingness in charge so Deng could take over. Even though we had like an 80% good, 20% bad appraisal of Xi. And so I was very interested in like, okay, so even Chinese scholars are not as enthusiastic as these new Dengist apologists. And with the Dengism has come some things that I found very strange, such as trying to rehabilitate the Khmer Rouge, trying to rehabilitate Stalin more than most Maoists have historically done. I mean, like, Mao's famous, 80% good, 20% bad. Like, he was willing to talk about the 20% bad. And if you were to read Losurdo, the historical nihilism charge, which, I've always pointed out, that has nothing to do, like, ruthless critique of everything but things that might be under pressure from Western powers is not at all what Marx was talking about. Like, nor is it a way to be honest about your need to change your policies. I mean, even from a communist point of view, if you were to assume you wanted the Chinese state to succeed, hiding your failures would not be a way to do that. And so I've been very confused by this turn. I first encountered it before even Monthly Review. I mean, I encountered Rockhill pretty early on and was like, I mean, I even though Colin's been on my show, I like Colin Bedell personally, but I have said that, like, the way Rockhill presents some things around, for example, the Frankfurt School, like, why aren't you bringing up that there were all kinds of Marxist-Leninists in the Roosevelt administration? Because the USSR was an ally. I don't if you're gonna go back and pretend that this was a CIA plot back all the way when the CIA didn't even exist yet, but we're talking about the OSS. I mean, he goes even farther than that, implying that like the State Department helping people to get over in 25 was somehow like a proto-CIA thing. I find this to be extremely problematic. But what I found even more interesting is when I read the Western Marxism book, it wasn't even that. It wasn't focused on things like the Congress of Cultural Freedom or, Commentary Magazine or things that I'm like, we really could talk about. Like, okay, how did the U.S. state could get these Marxists to capitulate this much? Losurdo's book was more almost I've called it a theodicy for why socialism failed. It doesn't make any sense when you think, or what? Excuse me, why socialism became unpopular, because he wouldn't say it failed on the West, by just stating that basically academics, half of whom were not even Marxists, somehow prevented the reception of Eastern Marxism to the West I don't know how that's a justifiable assertion. Like, it's just like, well, there were things going on, like stuff that happened in the Comintern in the 30s, stuff that Stalin encouraged in the 50s, the Sino-Soviet split. I mean, and while obviously Lucerdo picks a side on the Sino-Soviet split, he also doesn't want to talk about it. Like, and his disciples, Rock Hill, Carlos Garrido over from
Midwestern Marx.
Midwestern Marx, which became associated with MAGA communism, and thus been
Mm-hmm.
distanced from Rock Hill and Co. But they, I read their book on Western Marxism. It was just basically a crib of Lucerdo with a little bit of Rock Hill in it. That was pretty much all it was. So much so that I even went and looked at his Marx citations and saw that he cut off citations and cut out citations at the exact same places Rock Hill and Lucerdo had done, and often, frankly, dishonestly. And I'm not even sure he realized he was being dishonest, because I'm not sure that the scholarship indicated that he had read the entire text. So I've been kind of shocked by this tendency, because it has struck me as also getting a lot of accolades for being philosophically significant, even by friends of mine like Daniel Tutt. And I'm just like, well, I can see that for the liberalism book or the Bonapartism book, but some of this is shockingly bad scholarship. And it's just being promoted on face value. And I think you spelled that out, particularly the Western Marxism book. Would you like to talk about like what in Lucerdo's scholarship called attention to you? That you should be paying more attention to this.
Yeah, sure. And just to backtrack and address a few of the things you said, I understand that Lucerdo's books have had wide influence and appeal, and certain books more than others in terms of their reception. I am planning to have in uh, talk with Daniel on his podcast, kind of friendly but antagonistic, back and forth about Lucerdo's various claims and assertions. But yeah, in terms of like Garrido, it's almost like, and I haven't really read his book, but from what you've just said,
I read it word
it
for
seems
word
on
and checked all the citations.
yeah, so it seems almost like two steps removed, like based
Mhm.
on Rock Hill, who himself is basing himself loosely on Lucerdo. I do try to distinguish between Rock Hill and Lucerdo. Like Rock Hill, and again, I've only read his two of his long articles about like the Frankfurt School and the CIA, and French theory and whatnot. I understand that he has got this trilogy coming out from Monthly Review Press, in which he's gonna bring the receipts, I guess, and like bear it out in greater detail in terms of the archival work that he's been doing over the last few years. But to me, it like his thing, like who belonged to the OSS, who was publishing in like a CIA funded journal, Dermonat,
Mhm.
as Adorno did once, or who did they bring over for the structuralism conference, or did all these things that the CIA had its hands in. And again, the CIA, American intelligence agencies broadly, they throw their money around rather indiscriminately, often to undermine.
Particularly in the 50s and 60s. Like,
Yeah, I
yeah.
mean, their modus operandi was really to, if they saw a conflict anywhere around the world, their MO was to fund both sides and have whatever side came out on top feel like they were indebted to them. Obviously, they did favor certain outcomes, and uh, were looking to undermine uh, Soviet communism, Soviet Marxism, and
Mhm.
perhaps, I guess, had some vague interests in certain quarters to promote alternative forms of Marxism, which seems to be Rockhill's main contention. Lacerdo at least tries to thematize it, right? Like he views it, and he's using Perry Anderson's book on Western Marxism as a foil here, and we could talk about a little bit about that. But one of the main ways that Western Marxism, which again is a term that I think is fairly shaky conceptually, um, one of the way it's been conceptualized is as a product of defeat, and this is by figures who are more or less ambivalent about it. Figures like Perry Anderson, writing in a more Trotskyist vein in the 70s. Figures like Russell Jacoby, who was writing in a more council communist vein, who was very appreciative of it, who had a very positive view towards Western Marxism. And then, Losurdo, writing some 40 years later, from a Marxist-Leninist perspective, who had a very negative stance towards Western Marxism. He views it as a product of defeat that ignored the real successes of actually existing socialism, and was insensitive to the struggles that were faced by it that compromised the sort of pure vision of Marx, Engels, and Lenin, and also as tone deaf or neglectful of the anti-colonial revolt that was breaking out along the periphery of capitalism. So he doesn't try and like paint it in terms of like being funded by all these shadowy agencies the way that Rockhill seems to be really interested in. But there is nevertheless that confluence, and it seems like if Losurdo, or if Rockhill is kind of a pale imitation of Losurdo, then Garrido seems to have been like a pale imitation of Rockhill's. So at a double remove. But in any case, yeah. So Western Marxism, again, it's kind of like one can begin with the kind of poor interpretive, like some of the strong interpretive claims that I think are rather shaky. Just by looking at the way that Losurdo frames his own book as a response to Perry Anderson's considerations on Western Marxism, because considerations on Western Marxism really was written as kind of a critical balance sheet of the first 15 or so years of the New Left Review's activities, in which it was publishing all these translations of continental Marxists, from Adorno to Althusser to Gramsci to Coletti and Della Volpe. Really, like what Anderson wanted to do in that book was to say that yes, like they made important contributions, like they were very innovative theoretically, but time to put all this to bed. Like they really failed on their own terms and were handicapped by their divorce from the workers movement. We think that Trotskyism is the only theoretically like serious way to both recognize the limitations of Marxism Leninism, which Anderson, under Trotskyism influence, was willing to call Stalinism. Like we can acknowledge the limitations of Soviet Marxism without falling under the sway of the sort of dead end that is Western Marxism. So the way that Losurdo characterizes Anderson's position is that he's just uncritically celebrating the great, the ingenuity of the theoretical ingenuity of the Western Marxists, when that's quite far from the case. Again, like there's appreciative words here and there for various figures, especially more so Althusser and Coletti in the book, but he is quite far from considering himself an adherent of any of those schools of thought, especially by 1976, which is when considerations on Western Marxism came out. So even like the sort of framing device that Losurdo adopts is, in my opinion, a distortion. Like Anderson is not he's not endorsing Western Marxism at all. Like he's trying to weigh its relative strengths and weaknesses, but on the whole, he views it as kind of something to be abandoned.
Well, one of the things that's interesting, like reading the Western Marxism book, given its clear like Dengist orientation, when the two books that I don't know that I actually should be careful with this. I don't know how versed Losurdo is and Jacoby and Dialectic of Defeat, but he definitely was versed in Anderson, and yet, yeah, I have agreed with the other Anderson, with Kevin Anderson, that perhaps the Perry Anderson book probably set us back by accident, but that because for example, when I'm like, okay, so the Western Marxist supposedly is Lukács, who's tied to an actual Soviet government at one time. I don't I don't know how we parse this exactly. It's not like Lukács was a big supporter of the Hungarian uprising, for example. So it is interesting to me how that's all left out, but also the figures that Losurdo focuses on, only about half of them come up in either of those books. And like he doesn't get in Jacobi, there's whole sections about like the left communists and the KPD, and I mean really it's only the last fourth of Dialectic of Defeat that even talks about like Sartre and a lot of the French New Left. And I kind of my one interaction on my blog when I published about Jacobi's book, trying to repopularize it like many years later, was like, well, he was a little bit too optimistic about some of the stuff we saw in the 60s and like read it too outside of the context of Marxism Leninism in France. And he, his response to me was like, it was a long time ago. And I was like, well, that's fair. We couldn't have known. Like, fair point. But that you can't have that excuse when Western Marxism was released. But I've been somewhat taken aback also that like some figures who were very critical of that book, David Broder, for example, over there at Jacobin, they kept that criticism somewhat behind a paywall. Like if you were to read Broder's eulogy for Losurdo and Jacobin, you would not know Broder's own critiques of the Western Marxism book, which was published for the New Left Review, but specifically not in its public section. So, what do you make of that? Like, why has there been an unwillingness of a lot of people to even share the opinions that they published on about Losurdo?
Sure. Well, I mean, I think that there was just generally from the Verso crowd, the New Left Review Verso crowd, an uneasiness with his Stalino-Dengist politics. They obviously were quite embarrassed by the Stalin book, and when very Marxist-Leninists of various stripes continually petitioned to have Verso translate the book, they shut it down, and that the controversy around that has been fairly well documented. And the
Honestly, I
Western
kind of half
Marxism,
wish they had published it so that people would shut up about it.
I agree. I think they should have published it. But I mean, like, mostly just because I don't think that it's qualitatively that much worse than his other books. I mean, he recycles a lot of the same arguments that he employs in the books that they did publish, and the method that he employs in that book, the sort of comparative method or comparatistics, as he terms it, it's the same exact method, just applied to a different object, which is like the narratives surrounding Stalin, this black legend of Stalin. But yeah, to circle back to the point about Jacobi and dialectic of defeat, I'm fairly certain that he did not read. He was not that Lacerda was not aware of Jacobi's book, which um, anyone who's ever interested in Western Marxism, I always try and tell them that if you're going to read one book on Western Marxism, this thought figure, make it the Dialectic of Defeat. It's a great book. It's short. It's very well written. It's conceptually, I think, more rigorous than either Anderson or that is Perry Anderson or certainly Lacerdo. And just full disclosure, I actually met with Jacobi in LA as I was writing this piece and just trying to figure out all the different politics of different left-wing publishing houses from the 60s through the 80s, around this term Western Marxism. But yeah, I mean, like, I would say, like, and just to, kind of put this to bed, Western Marxism, I think, at its most coherent, like, in its most coherent use or sense, is rather narrowly defined as like centered around the fallout from two sort of foundational texts in the 20s, which are explicitly Hegelian Marxist, which are, of course, the long essay Marxism and Philosophy by Karl Korsch and the essay collection History and Class Consciousness by Georg Lukács. His London book was also important. He also had a defense of the History and Class Consciousness book that was only unearthed like 70 years later.
The Taylism
Uh,
book.
the Taylism, yeah, and the Dialectic book, which is an excellent text. But I mean, it was not really. It was like rotting away in an archive. But the way that Maurice Merleau-Ponty, who really popularized the phrase Western Marxism in a very famous essay in his book Adventures of the Dialectic, and the way that then Jacobi picked it up, and then Kevin Anderson, was they use Western Marxism really to refer only to this sort of Hegelianized Marxism. So figures like the Frankfurt School, and in France, then Henri Lefebvre and Jean-Paul Sartre, um, they, I mean, there was some like parallel between, especially like Lefebvre and the Frankfurt School, stuff that Alfred Schmidt, who was a student of Adorno, pointed out, the kind of um, parallel course that they were kind of on.
Mm-hmm.
But what they all had in common, Merleau-Ponty, Sartre, Lefebvre, and the Frankfurt School, was this reference to Lukács and the Korsch, which was very, very influential for them. Anderson adding on like Gramsci and structuralist Marxism a la Althusser and his students, and then the anti-Hegelian Marxisms of Coletti and his student, or Della Volpe and his student Coletti, um, really turns Western Marxism into a kind of unmanageable figure because it just houses too many divergent tendencies within it. And then the way that Losurdo uses it is even more nonsensical, because I mean, he adds in other figures that are self-declared Marxists. Like he talks about the Aphorismo, people like Tronti and Negri.
Mm-hmm.
Then of course Badiou and Zizek. But he also talks about figures who were not only non-Marxists,
Some of them are
but
anti-Marxist.
very, yeah, vocally anti-Marxist. Like, I mean, apart from a very short flirtation with Maoism, Foucault was pretty hostile to Marxism. He dismissed Marx himself as a minor Ricardian. Arendt was like virulently anti-communist, even if she did have some sort of appreciative nods towards Marx in her book on the human condition and the first couple volumes of the origins of totalitarianism. She was a Cold War liberal, and in some ways even fairly reactionary. Uh, Depends on when we're talking about. But then, of course, Agamben too, whose treatment in the Western Marxism book is just like almost laughably um, short and like indirect. He, like, Lacerda takes issue with him writing a sort of laudatory introduction to a book by Levinas, which is very anti-communist. Like, at least, like, you know, even if I found Perry Anderson's definition of Western Marxism to be unmanageably broad, it at least had the virtue of including only avowed Marxists. Whereas, like with Lacerda, it just goes all over the place. And even within that, like the scholarship, as you mentioned earlier, is pretty poor throughout.
I mean, we could talk about that. One of the things I was gonna bring up is, do you think what motivated what was in inclusion was from a specifically Italian context? Because I was thinking about, okay, what weird things were Euro communists trying to synthesize in the 80s into their melange of post-Marxist Leninism that Lacerda was reacting to? And but even I'm like, I don't know anyone who would have cited Hannah Arendt positively. So I was at a loss for that. I was like, okay, I can kind of see Foucault, because you have those flirtations through Negri, and you have the kind of post-Aphorismo, post-autonomia period in the 80s and 90s, and then, left populism with Laclau. Fine, I can see that trajectory from Eurocommunism to left populism. but that has nothing to do with the Marxism of that's being critiqued in the 1920s. I mean, it really is. When you talk about, we were talking about Garrido being like 2 steps removed from Losurdo. When you're trying to link 90s Hart and Negri and Laclau to, I don't know, Ernst Bloch or Karl Korsch, that's like 25 steps removed. You know, in fact, honestly, one of the big screaming things in the room, and something Losurdo is not breaking up, is a lot of the things that he's talking about are kinds of divergent Marxist Leninisms. They're not even like Trotskyism or Hegelian Marxism, you know, purely. There's things that happened from former Marxist Leninists or active Marxist Leninists in some case in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. And that seemed obscured in his book, you know. So I didn't know what to do with that. You know, I remember, for example, reading Garrido, who again is like, you know, basically a watered down version of this, but in some ways the watering down actually amplifies the implications, and they're not hidden, they're just stated outright. Where like
Sure.
there's an attempt to make Jay Sakai a CIA agent and an anarchist. There's an attempt to make Badiou some kind of anarchist because he doesn't believe in the state, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I'm like, Badiou's a weird Platonic Maoist. I mean, you know, I don't know how you, like, he's actually part of your tradition. And the only thing I think they share is they are not Chinese or Russian thinkers. But then the other thing I will tell you is there aren't a lot of Chinese or Russian thinkers cited positively in any developed way in any of the Losurdo texts I've read. So it's not like he's presenting that, other than official statements from Deng, Mao, etc.,
Yeah,
as having a developed tradition, because he just doesn't seem to know it, or if he does, he's not sharing it. Go ahead.
this is true, and yeah, politically, I mean, again, the different figures who've been grouped together under this rubric of Western Marxism are all over the place, and that's even just strictly speaking the ones who considered themselves Marxists. So the
Mhm.
Frankfurt School, from its foundation, the Institute of Social Research, was, you know, it was designed to be sort of a non-denominational Marxist institution, because it had to
Mhm.
play it had to walk this tightrope essentially between the Social Democratic Party in Germany and the Bolsheviks, because the Marx Engels Institute wanted to publish all of Marx's works, and the archive was held by the SPD. um, they couldn't come out strongly on one side or the other, and indeed their members like were all over the place. So Marcuse, of course, was at a very young age, as a teenager. In fact, he took part in the Spartacus uprising in Berlin. um, Horkheimer was very close with members of the Bavarian Soviet in Munich.
Mhm.
um, you know, they had various USPD members, so part of the Independent Social Democratic Party that was anti-war, or opposed to the war. But then you had figures, and again, that's just the Frankfurt School, which I would say is more interesting than, you know, the French and Italian figures that he talks about, because they recognized the crisis of Marxism earlier. But when you look at the French and Italian context, especially, those are figures who were heterodox, but largely remained within under the wing of the PCF in French, so the official Marxist-Leninist Communist Party, and the PCI in Italy. So Althusser, I mean, he joined rather late. He joined after the war. He was not a partisan in the way that Sartre was, or the way that his wife was. Um, but he was a card-carrying member of the PCF from 48 until his death. Like, he never renounced it. He never strayed from the party.
Mhm.
He Some of his writings, some of his interpretations did not sit well with like figures like Roger Garaudy, who is like the official theorist of the PCF, who was more of a humanist, Hegelian humanist. But he never left the party, and he did, of course, his pro-Mao statements, his endorsement of Mao's On Contradiction essay. Of course, that was provocative, but was still within the bounds of acceptability. Um, in Italy, with Operaismo, is a bit interesting because Mario Tronti and various other figures who began in the PCI, they did kind of stray from it for a little while, but they made their way back in 1967 and remained in the party up until its dissolution in 1991. Della Volpe never left. Coletti, of course, became like a virulent anti-communist, eventually a supporter of Berlusconi. But I mean, he's obviously like an unusual case, and that's another thing that like was just mind-boggling to me. It's just like in terms of the objects of critique that Losurdo chose. Like, if you're going to critique Western Marxists, like, why are you looking at texts by Lukács and Bloch from 1915 through 1917 when they were not Marxists? And Lukács became a Marxist by the early 20s. Bloch really only became a Marxist in the early 30s.
Right.
And then also looking at interviews and lectures by Horkheimer from the 70s, which is like after he had completely disavowed Marxism, and Coletti from the 80s, like again, total disavowal of Marxism. So, I mean, unless you want to say like there was something within their thought, incipient within their thought when they were Marxists that led them to eventually embrace anti-Marxism, which is not the case that Losurdo is trying to make, or if there was something residual within their pre-Marxist writings that carried over into their Marxist days, which again is not the argument that that Losurdo makes, then why include these texts at all? It seems to be outside the scope of the inquiry, or what should be the inquiry.
Right. I mean, even if we took a really broad brush, as in your first article against Losurdo, you mentioned that why doesn't he deal with the British Marxists like E.P. Thompson, Stuart Hall, Wayman Williams, Rodney Hilton, etc.? Why doesn't he deal with the situationists and post-situationists like Lefebvre, Debord, Vanagim, which the name who I cannot say? Why didn't he deal with the post-Marxists like Casaradis or Lyotard? Or I mean, like, there's lots of like, I would go after some of those people.
Sure, or the Americans, like the Johnson Forest tendency. I mean,
Right.
Dunayevskaya. I mean, obviously he would object to CLR James and Dunayevskaya for their one-time Trotskyism, but again, they're at least Marxists. So that's more than can be said for Arendt or Foucault or Agamben.
Right. Well, I mean, I guess CLR James is notorious eclectic for a Marxist because he's like got Marxist Spengalism at certain points. But one of the things is you can't accuse him of ignoring the Third World revolts and decolonial revolutions. He wrote several books about it and supported it. So, like, it's
Y-
just go ahead.
Yeah, you can't do that for Sartre either. I mean, obviously, like he was the poster boy for criticizing French colonialism in Algeria and in other parts of the world as well. And Sebastiano Timpanaro, again,
Mm.
who is not as well known in he's not as well known in the States, or not as well remembered. He was briefly promoted during New Left Review's Trotskyism phase of the 70s. Him and Livia Matan, and of course Ernest Mandel. But Timpanaro was like also very outspoken in his anti-colonialism. So the way that Losurdo tries to what he finds them guilty of is of not adopting his own prescribed anti-colonial um, stance, which is he outlines this in his book on class struggle, which is, again, if one wanted to read one book to get like an overall sense of Losurdo's like theoretical outlook, class struggle is probably the place to start. I think you can get a lot of it just negatively by looking at Western Marxism, which is, of course, the book that I chose. That's the book that I chose to use as my point of departure polemically. But in his class struggle book, he outlines this two phase anti-colonial revolt. The first phase being military and political. The second, and that's basically revolt, the uprising, kicking out the colonizers. And then the second part is the sort of state-led industrialization, the economic phase. And because I guess he thinks that Sartre in his book on dialectical reason was too enamored of the fused group, which is associated with like the revolution at its most political and its most exuberant phase, and was less interested in the sort of institutional and organizational phase that Losurdo sees as necessary in the post military phase. That's why Losurdo thinks that his theoretical outlook is actually at odds with his own stated anti-colonialism. And similar thing goes with Timpanaro. But again, I suspect personally that what Losurdo really had an issue with Timpanaro was his Trotskyism.
Well, I mean, this is one of the things I try to point out is like between Marxist-Leninists and Trotskyists on international questions, I can find Marxist-Leninists agreeing with Trotskyists versus Marxist-Leninists and other Trotskyists who've taken the opposite position on almost any question, particularly after 1965. And so, and there are the great ironies of the world, like, one of the largest anti-revisionist Marxist organizations in the United States today has Trotskyist origins. And
yeah, and that was
go ahead.
Yeah, and that's the organization to which Rockhill briefly belonged, though I understand that he left.
He has left, yeah.
Kind of bad terms. But yeah, so I mean, that's school, the PSL, the Marcyites, that I would see is largely receptive to this kind of to Losurdo's brand of Marxism-Leninism. Obviously, the CPUSA and Garrido, like I'm actually not sure. I think he probably does have some, still have some affinity for Losurdo, but other figures within the ACP, it's interesting. They take an issue with Losurdo's anti-Americanism because of their patriotic socialist disposition. They want to celebrate the American Revolution as authentically revolutionary, which I actually believe is probably in line with Marx, Engels, and Lenin's own appraisal of
even in line with Stalin's
revolution.
appraisal, to be honest.
Same, yeah, I agree. I view the stance that the CPUSA has taken in PSL and beyond, the sort of Losurdo and Gerald Horne line of casting aspersions on bourgeois revolutions outside of the French Revolution, and specifically the American Revolution. That I view that as more an outcome, an artifact of the New Left, than of classical Marxism Leninism or classical Stalinism.
Yeah, no, I mean, it like if you read Stalin on the American Revolution, it's actually very clear that you would not agree with Gerald Horne. I mean, and the problem that you have is, ironically, for all their talk about dialectics, is it actually is an undialectical position that if you compare the French Revolution to the American Revolution, where you can say, well, the American Revolution had comprador factors, settler colonialism, etc. And I'm like, that's all in the French Revolution. It's all there in the French Revolution. It's undeniably there in the French Revolution. Otherwise, the Haitian Revolution doesn't fucking happen. Right? Like, so it's, I just think this is a very one-sided view of revolution that seems to me to come out of, I mean, I'm not going to say that they're wrong about like the contradictory values of bourgeois society, but like that was true in the French case too. And that doesn't mean it's not a revolution, particularly it's not a bourgeois revolution.
But another case they never bring up is the Creole revolutions in Latin America, which had a similar dynamic of being led by really the upper crust of colonial society, so the richest, wealthiest Creoles, who were not mixed, they were not mestizo, they were not mulatto, in the sort of hierarchy of the racial hierarchy of Latin America, as such as it existed. And many of them were slave owners and continue to have slaves long after separating from the Spanish Empire. And again, like you don't see them like casting doubt upon the sort of revolutionary status of Bolivar or
Yeah.
Martin, like
Which
in the
Marx
way that they
explicitly
do.
did, by the way. Like Marx wrote a whole article about
Marx
how
did, yeah,
Boulevard was terrible. Like,
yeah.
go
In
ahead.
fact, it's interesting. Yeah, yeah. That's the one bourgeois revolutionary who he really did view as kind of a kind of pale imitation of Napoleon,
Right. Right.
and
I mean,
disliked on that basis. Yeah.
yeah, I mean, I have actually on my show, on the Patreon side of my show, I actually read that article and I was like, that's harsher than I would be.
Oh yeah, it's
Um,
very harsh. It was like for an encyclopedia entry on Bolivar, and it's like it's like yeah, Marx was wilding out. It was crazy.
um, and what I find fascinating about that is it's just sort of not dealt with, or what I'll be told is like Marx was racist, and I'm like, well, so is Boulevard. Like Boulevard,
Sure.
like tried to introduce like tried to keep the racial caste system. It's not like we're dealing with like La Cosmica Raza and Mexico and 100 years later. Like this is something completely different.
That's why that
And
happens 100 years later, is because that hierarchy was still in place.
right. So it's just like but I mean everybody leaves out Latin America. I can't really, to be fair to Losurdo, it doesn't get brought up enough, period.
Sure.
But you really come at him on some of his weird readings. I mean, and what I found surprising is some of the most confusing readings seem to be like Tampanaro and other Italians, which again is hard to argue that he doesn't understand the context because he might have knew some of these people.
Yeah, I'm sure he probably knew he knew Tronti, and like because Tronti was like an elected official for the Communist Party, and in the post-communist aftermath. Um, Yeah, I mean, it's just strange. I mean, like he takes issue with stuff like that he wrote in like the book Workers and Capital, which I mean, again, like, and I said this on Asked Horizon too. Like, one thing that I can perhaps thank Lucerdo for is that I'd long been putting off reading some of these foundational theoretical works. Like, I'd never read the Critique of Dialectical Reason before undertaking this review or this series of articles. I'd never read Tronti's Workers and Capital. I found myself quite impressed by them. I mean, I think Critique of Dialectical Reason has some serious problems with it, but it's still a laudable effort. And Workers and Capital, I was very very impressed by Tronti's book. But what do you like specifically to get to the point you were zeroing in on, like his objections to the workerists, of which Tronti was the most visible and most articulate, you know, representative, really are very confusing to me. Like one of the things that, and I guess it's just because Lacerdo felt that Western Marxists should genuflect before actually existing socialist states and statesmen, figures like Mao. Like I guess Tronti in his book Workers and Capital, because he is so laser focused on the opposition between workers and capital, the sort of fundamental class antagonism of capitalist society. He thinks that that Tronti neglects like the colonial question, other struggles like in the domestic sphere and whatnot, but really the colonial question. So in that book, like he says that the struggle between workers in like heavily industrialized zones is like more important than the revolts of all the colonial peoples put together. Which, again, it seems like a hyperbolic statement, but Franti was trying to like he really was quite ambitious about the idea of like fomenting a European revolution, even in the '60s. And then in this 2009 introduction that he wrote to it, where he said we were never Chinese, we were never interested in like this long march or like the countryside against the city. Like, why is Lacerdo faulting him for that? I mean, were the workerists supposed to adopt a protracted people's war in heavily industrialized northern Italy, which is like where the bulk of their activities took place? It makes no
which
sense. The context is absolutely different. Like, and I
which
think that
Maoism under, I mean, we do have the problem of the divisions of Maoism, which is again something that Losurdo doesn't even deal with, right? But like
Mhm.
classical Maoism, by the time it's codified in the mid 70s, would say the Italians shouldn't be doing that. It was only in Latin America, separate from China, where there was a form of Maoism that tried to universalize it to the entire world.
Yeah,
Um,
exactly. Mao himself, like he, if you know, and I imagine he was fairly well informed on the state of class struggle in various European countries, like that, you know, like he would look at that and say, like, no, like, you know, there are, you can't have a theory of four classes such as we tried to use in you know, China in the 30s. It just doesn't make sense. That was historically specific moment.
right,
Like,
you're not in the periphery in the same way. You know, your job is to foment class struggle in the core. I mean, like he wouldn't use core; he would use it in the first world. But like, you know, and again, I say he would have used it in the first world in a certain time period because Mao's frameworks changed like 5 times during his life.
mhm.
Um,
Yeah, three worlds theory era.
yeah,
Yeah.
three world theory, new democracy. I think new democracy is never completely denounced, but again, I mean, I was actually surprised in all this promotion of Chinese thought that there was no real dealing with, like, I mean, even the stuff about Deng, like Deng was not Mao's successor, even after the crushing of the Gang of Four. It was the people we now call the Nothingists, are the center of the party, Ho, and that group. And I mean, I will admit that Western historiography and Western history of this is so bad that it, like, I've checked it online, they don't mention it. But I'm like, no, Deng's rehabilitated, but he doesn't come to power until 1982 in the reinstatement of the new constitution. So what are you even talking about here? What,
Yeah, there's a
you
blank
know,
spot. There's a blank spot from 1977 through
through
1982.
1982, it's just like we just don't talk
Yeah.
about those 5 years. um,
Yeah, I mean
uh,
it's kind of similar. It's kind of similar with, like, I mean, supporters of the various, like, Western communist parties, like, you know, after Brezhnev, before Gorbachev, there's, like, you know, a 5-year period where Brezhnev was clearly on the decline, and there was Andropov, and, like, only later does Gorbachev then emerge, and, you know, obviously there's a lot of hemming and hawing about, you know, what he represented. But yeah, I mean, there's all these different gaps. I mean, that you know, Western communist parties and Western Marxist Leninists just have to kind of, you know, leave unaddressed, so as to maintain what I view as a sort of untenable apologia for these states and the course that history eventually took. And really polemically, I mean, beyond just sort of like the misreadings and sloppy citational practices of Lacerda, which I try to document in a fair degree of detail. The broader polemical point of my argument against Lacerda is against what I call his neo-Stalinism. And I understand, like, Stalinism um, is a contested term, and probably my use of it is most consonant with uh, certain versions of Trotskyism and the historical tendency to which I'm most sympathetic, even if I don't think that any of these tendencies are vital tendencies in the present day. Left communism, the communist left historically, they understood Stalinism, and I would say that certain parts of the Frankfurt School, insofar as they were conversant with, like, council communist positions, adopted a similar attitude towards Stalinism. They understood it as basically an accommodation to defeat, a rationalization of the course that history took, and of the failure of the world revolution of 1917 through 1923. I understand that there are people who define Stalinism more narrowly as just referring to the sort of period of high authoritarianism under Stalin himself, and you know, forced, all the things that are associated with that, like the purges, forced collectivization, etc. But I think like zooming out and understanding Stalinism as a sort of world historical phenomenon defined by certain characteristic positions, that, you know, the most obvious of which is socialism in one country. um, I think that it's fair to characterize Losurdo's entire sort of philosophical historical project as underwriting this worldview philosophically, intellectually. Basically justifying the course that history has taken, apotheosized in the present day Chinese state with its sort of extended market reforms, um, its large bureaucratic apparatus superintending the commanding heights of production, to use the traditional language that they used. Um, and yeah, I mean, he in some ways, like, he even goes further than Stalin. I tried to say this toward the end of the piece, like, whereas obviously Stalin almost accidentally came up with the slogan of socialism in one country and the debates of 1925. He wasn't the one to really theorize it. Actually, Bukharin took it
Yes,
from him,
Bukharin
and
did it.
he was the one who, yeah, like Stalin came up with the slogan, but then Bukharin really fleshed it, gave it some theoretical meat, put theoretical meat on the bones of that slogan. But, you know, at least verbally, Stalin continued to pay lip service to the doctrine of the withering away of the state. That, I mean, again, it's just unavoidable. Lenin wrote an entire book on it and, documented it in great detail, all the different statements. I mean, in his, what I think of as kind of his book report on Marx and Engels and the state and revolution. Um, so Stalin, even if in practice he continued to sort of build up the state apparatus, as part of his like socialism under siege, um, combating imperialism, he at least still, held to the letter of Marx, Engels, and Lenin, saying that in a fully communist society, the state would dissolve. Losurdo goes a step further than Stalin in revising Marx, Engels, and Lenin's theory. Not only revising it in the sense that Stalin did with socialism in one country, but also by saying that the entire notion that the state would ever disappear was from the very outset misguided. And that's kind of like the entire third part of my essay, which is certainly the most Marxological of the three, tries to reconstruct the logic of coordinated international proletarian revolution on the one hand, and then the notion that society would reassume some of the powers that have been alienated in the form of the state in a fully socialized society after class antagonisms have been done away with.
Hmm. Well, I guess this brings me to what I can say is the part of this that interested me when I started really suspecting something of Losurdo. It wasn't the Stalin book, although I knew about it, and I read one of the bootleg translations before it even came out from Iskra. And it wasn't the Western Marxism, which I did not read until it came out. I knew about it, but I didn't read it. But it was the Hegel book, which was already available in English, because I saw it as a refutation of State and Revolution by Lenin, just a flat out refutation of that, and a flat out refutation of Marx specifically on that text. Like, the text that Marx actually published his critique of, as opposed to the critique of Hegel's philosophy in general. You can say that Marx never finished it and thus didn't publish it, and maybe that's not part of like formal Marxist thought. Fine. But you can't do that for his critique of philosophy of right, because that was published. So what do we make of Losurdo's thing there? Because I personally, when I read it, I was like, to me, this is an anti-Marxist book in so much that it's basically arguing at core that a classless society as defined by Marx and Engels and Lenin and even Stalin and Mao is impossible. Mm-hmm. Like, this to me feels like authoritarian liberalism with anti-colonial characteristics, but that's all I really got. But what is your take on that book?
Yeah, so interestingly, and I think you raised this in a conversation that you had on the topic of Western Marxism recently. I forget with who, but Jacobi defined, or one of the ways that he understood the split between Western and Eastern Marxism was in terms of which Hegel different figures focused on. So whereas whereas the foundational text for one strand of Eastern Marxism, the Deborahnites, who were like the premier Hegelian Marxists in the Soviet Union, they eventually met with a tragic end. They were purged by Stalin, but for them, they really stressed the dialectic of nature, Engel's dialectic of nature, and for them, the Hegel text that they looked to, going back to Plekhanov, was the science of logic. The Western Marxists that are the topic of Jacobi's book, figures like Lukács and Korsch, for them, their focus was on subjectivity, on problems of consciousness, the dialectic of subject and object. For them, their Bible was the phenomenology of spirit. For Losurdo, it's really the elements of the philosophy of right. But also, I mean, like this is a recurrent theme in Losurdo's work in general. He's interested in problems of self-censorship. So he has a book which has not been translated into English on Kant's self-censorship, which obviously was extensive. He had to hide his sympathy for the French Revolution. He had to hide the extent to which he was critical of religion. Then, obviously, the self-censorship of Hegel. So what he does in that book, and I will give some credit where credit is due. I think he does establish pretty well that there is a higher degree of radicalism in Hegel's unpublished notes for his lectures, and some of the stuff that was recorded by his students that was not eventually translated or published or compiled in Elements of the Philosophy of Right. So there's a disjuncture between what he was saying in lecture halls and the book that he eventually published, where famously, the realist, the rational, etc. But really, the sort of, if you're reading between the lines, and really trying to understand what Losurdo is taking away from Hegel's theory of right and theory of the state, is that the state is like the sort of culmination of rationality that Hegel thought it to be. And that again, as you point out, is like that's one of the premier reversals that Marx does in his critique of Hegel. Is like he sees the state, first of all, as an expression of as the expression of an antagonism within civil society, and sees it as determined by the state rather than the state determining civil society. So the state is determined by civil society rather than civil society determining the state. That's one of Marx's formative criticisms of Hegel. For him, and like really, like it's like a long and winding book where he talks about various disputes within Hegel scholarship, but the main takeaway there is that he supports a kind of like strong state interventionist regime that exists to curb the excesses of civil society. So the kinds of poverty that arise within civil society due to property relations. And like he has this whole discourse on the figure of Notrecht, which is like, this idea of like kind of necessity, that this sort of absolute necessity that is expressed by extreme immiseration, that people are justified in seeking to amend their condition of penury. So for him, like the state becomes a kind of like ineliminable feature of every mode of production. um, from earliest origins of recorded history up through even the potential abolition of capitalism, as as Losurdo understands it. It's unclear. He doesn't really say whether or not class antagonisms can be overcome or not, but it seems like he thinks that even if, and it's unclear how he defines class really. He seems to have this kind of expansive understanding of class and class struggle. But regardless of that, he believes that some sort of entity has to, still maintain an existence in order to guarantee the rule of law, which he, views as something that cannot be eliminated either. So law itself will persist. And I think inevitably one has to think that, like, the stuff that Lenin understood by the state, the sort of special bodies of armed men, like figures like police forces, um, perhaps a standing military, would never go away. And again, to me, like this, to me, like between the Hegel book and between the book on class struggle, where he talks about what he views as the sort of utopian holdovers in Marx, Engels, and even Lenin,
Mhm.
all these different institutions that they predicted would wither away. Um, they found, like, he just looking at the history of actually existing socialism, he says, oh well, they may have thought this in their naivete, but things like the market, the family, the state, um, money, like they've persisted. There's not even been any progress in eliminating them. Hence, we have to correct this misguided prediction of Marx, Engels, and Lenin, which he conceptualizes as the idealism of practice. And it's a strange philosophical move, but he also, and this is a kind of a way to tie it back to his understanding of Hegel and the later Lukács. Um, he views this as sort of residual Fichteanism, um, this idealism of practice. So Fichte, and Losurdo has written 3 books untranslated on Fichte, which Fichte is a complicated figure, went through different phases himself. Um, but in the phase of his greatest enthusiasm for the French Revolution, he viewed the French Revolution as kind of uh, a political analog for his philosophy. His philosophy sought to get rid of the Kantian Ding on sick, the thing in itself, which is kind of a limit concept for Kant. He believed that reality was sort of mutable and susceptible to transformation through conscious action. And for Losurdo, to the extent that he believes that Marx, Engels, and Lenin adopted this Fichtean position, um, he believed that this was robbing or depriving uh, historically congealed institutions of their social being, of their thingness, of their independence from like practical manipulation. So he appeals to the philosophy of the later Lukács, his ontology of social being, where he tries to theorize the kind of durability of various institutions from whence they arise and whatnot. I mean, Lukács, I don't think um, ever renounces the idea that the state would eventually wither away either. But again, Lacerda is just sort of drawing willy nilly upon different theories, whether it's from the late Lukács, whether it's from Hegel and his philosophy of right, that is supposed to talk about the rationality, the enduring rationality of these different institutions, the nation, etc. And for him, like he points to the history of actually existing socialist states and says, "Oh well, this helps to explain why why the Sino-Soviet split occurred. This helps to explain why Yugoslavia, the USSR, became estranged. This helps to explain why there was a war between Cambodia and Vietnam. This helps to explain why Vietnam and China went to war." To me, obviously, it's just a much simpler answer. These states, despite their socialist pretensions, are not the kind of emancipated society, or even a sort of way station toward the kind of emancipated society that Marx, Engels, and Lenin envisioned. Obviously, history took a different course than the one that they anticipated, but I don't think that it invalidates their original prescription.
Mhm. Well, to me, it like I get arguing that we don't see these things in society as they are now, but if you look at how, like, say, Engels defines class and what the state does and what the state is, if there is a body of our men who do not come from general society and have special privileges, that is a class for Lenin. Excuse me, I said Engels, but for Lenin, in State and Revolution. And you might go, okay, well, that isn't happening, and and our answer would be it's either not a liberal society or that Marxism is impossible. But Losurdo doesn't want to do that, and that's what
Mhm.
confuses. I mean, I guess that's what confuses me, because when you like when you go through what he would retain from current liberal society, it's almost everything except a more interventionist state. That's really the only thing that's different between what he's advocating for as the ultimate goal. Like, this is not like the Marxist Leninist or even Trotskyist view that like some of these things will be necessary in transition, but your goal is
they're
to
necessary
get rid of them.
forever.
Right.
Yeah, they're necessary forever, according to Losurdo.
Yeah, they're absolutely necessary forever because civil society has to be controlled. And I'm just like, that's just, to me, that's more Hobbes than Marx. And even if he gets to it through an interesting reading of Hegel. And to get back to your thing about Hegel, I agree with you that Hegel is more radical in his private correspondence, but there are leaps that Losurdo and Losurdians make with Colin Bodell, and I actually got an argument about this where I was like, I do not believe you when you keep on asserting that Hegel was an atheist and that he does not believe in the religious propositions he put forward. I know that's convenient for a lot of people today, but there's no evidence for it, not even in the private notebooks. You have to deduce that. And at this point, you're basically just doing like a Dengist version of Leo Strauss, which is what is unstated equals the worldview that I think was always there, but it's hidden, but it matches with my worldview. And I can't argue that one way or another because it's basically a counterfactual.
Agreed. Yeah, I mean, like, I would say that like the most productive readings of Hegel was as an atheist, but I understand that to have been the sort of willful distortion on the part of the young Hegelians, like
Right.
Bauer and Stern. Like, it was an interesting polemical, I mean, especially because Hegel's philosophy was taken up by all these prominent Lutheran theologians. As I think probably like in his private life he was a Lutheran. I mean, there's just no evidence to the contrary. I agree with you 100%. I mean, one could perhaps construe. I mean, obviously Kant had pietist origins, like his family was pietist, but at most one could maybe think of him as a sort of deist. But I mean, really, I think it's pretty clear from Hegel's just body of work, both published and unpublished, that he remained a kind of Lutheran. That obviously for him, Protestantism had this great philosophical significance. Luther, obviously, as expressing like the principle of subjectivity, cutting out the middleman of this, the church as, the intercession of the church in communicating with the divine. But yeah, I mean, yeah, I would agree with you 100% there. Um, in terms of like the special bodies of armed men, like even if one would construe it as not a class, it's still a symptom of you know the persistence of class antagonism. Like, to me, like the existence of police forces, like prisons, standing armies, this to me is symptomatic of an unfree society. And I think to eliminate that is to lower the horizons of social transformation that Marxism uh, really envisioned. Uh, Lasordo, to his credit, partially, I think he's willing to make that. He's willing to sort of say what
Admit that.
say what Stalinists, like in their fidelity to Marx, Engels, and Lenin, at least what they wrote, their verbal fidelity to that. They're unwilling to part with that, but he's willing at least to sort of, in that respect, Lycert is quite useful because I think in adopting this forthrightly, he opens himself up to the sort of reasoned criticism that um, other Stalinists, perhaps like by keeping this as a more guarded position, are unwilling to open themselves up to. But there is a certain honesty in that respect, even if I find Lacerda's mode of argumentation and his citational practices, his scholarship, broadly speaking, often quite dishonest or disingenuous. He at least has the honesty um, to adopt these positions rather stridently. And the analogy that he uses, and again, it's curious to me because his choice of analogy just is given this figure's reputation, one would think that it would be quite unpopular as a choice, but he uses this analogy, but first of all, in an article and then in the book against revisionism, the War and Revolution book. He analogizes Marx, Engels, and the various Marxists whom they inspired with the figure of Christopher Columbus. Columbus, of course, set out and in search of the Indies, but stumbled upon America. So the analogy for Losurdo is that these Marxists like set out in search of this radically transformed world. What they ended up with was all the stuff that ended up happening with actually existing socialism. Hence, we have to come to terms with reality. We need to shed these kinds of utopian, unrealistic holdovers of Marx, Engels, and Lenin themselves, and admit that the course that history took was the only one it ever could have taken, and we should adopt our expectations accordingly.
I would say, though, that makes his argument against Western Marxism to be somewhat nonsensical, because if the course of history is the only one it could have taken, then that is also the only course it could have been taken.
Yeah, and I mean this is part of it's like, and again here I think Rockhill is more explicit than Losurdo, because Rockhill also tries to tie Western Marxism to this whole figure of the labor aristocracy, which Rockhill construes Western Marxism as a kind of intellectual expression of the labor aristocracy, and a rather strong reading of the labor aristocracy that I would say consigns the entire proletariat in Western Europe, North America, etc., to this figure, this global figure of a labor aristocracy, and hence unrevolutionary, untrustworthy, and thus we have to the task of Marxists is really just to cheer on revolution in the third world, which is the only place that revolution can occur.
It is a soft third worldism that Losurdo is actually promoting. I mean, I say soft because he will not say things like there is no such thing as a revolutionary proletariat in the developed world, but he will imply it. Now, I will also say, because I've recently been doing readings on the third worldism is not particularly coherent on this. There are third worldists who do believe that there's a revolutionary proletariat in the developed world, but the labor aristocracy theory, which, for those of you who don't know, it's a comment about labor aristocracy, originally referred to in the classical socialist movement like leaders of unions and other people who have privileged positions that put them above the rest of the class. And this Engels remarks that this really explained the lack of activity in the British movement because of the core of empire. That is expanded a little bit and with Lenin, because Lenin talks about it a bit in Imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism. But again, he is not saying that there is no real proletariat in the cores of capital. He's just, he's talking about the dominance of a certain strand of labor. By the time you get to the 1980s, and you have people going back to these statements, or maybe the 1970s around Jay Sakai, for example, although he completely racializes this. Yep. By the time you get to the 1970s and race, or the 1980s with nations, you get this idea that the developed world proletariat has been bought off, that it gets paid more than its value. There's a bunch of other stuff. Eventually, they even start rejecting labor theory of value, which, Monthly Review had already had the standard of doing.
With Sweezy and Baran, for sure.
Right. But you see this amongst the third worldists, and Rockhill picks a lot of that up, but doesn't pick all of it up. And I'm not sure what to make of his selectivity there. So he seems to think that, labor aristocracy is a problem in the developed world, and all we need to do is cheer on these third world revolutions. And my response is like, that's not a viable. I mean, even if you believe it, which is such an inversion of classical Marxism as to basically just say most of classical Marxism is just wrong. But if you do believe that, then what viable politics do you think you could possibly have? Like, because there's no action you can take in your own country. And there's not much you can do to support the third world revolutions either. So it's like, okay, so what? Like, that doesn't, like, basically the status quo stays the same if this is your logic. Like, if you
Yeah,
take it to the extreme.
you're kind of relieved of any responsibility to organize the working class and wherever it is that you happen to be. I guess if you're like Roland Bohr, who's a kind of Australian Stalin Dengist who moved from Australia to China, I guess that's one possible move. You can just straightforwardly be employed by the Chinese state. But
But again, you have to come up with a special category to argue that China isn't developed, which I have a hard time doing when it's the most productive society on the planet and full of billionaires.
sure, yeah,
Like,
I would
I
agree.
just...
And this is some cognitive dissonance that they have yet to work through. But I mean, if you choose to remain in the beating heart of capitalism, if you've got a professorship at the University of Urbino or at Villanova, then I mean, I guess the most that you have to do is publish books through Monthly Review Press or write the occasional article that asserts that there is some sort of revolutionary continuity between 1848 to 1871 to 1917, 1949, and current day Xi's China. That this is some unbroken revolutionary thread that, perhaps there were some minor setbacks, but, it's still leading the way, leading toward the inevitability of a world revolution, and led by the different oppressed peoples of the world and their joint dictatorship with the proletariat. Yeah, and I mean it's unclear too because the proletariat itself becomes shrunk in this vision. Um, yeah, I mean for Engels, I mean Marx never uses the term labor aristocracy. I think that there is like just quite obviously, some empirical sociological validity to this category of the labor
I do
aristocracy,
too.
such as Engels and Lenin described it. I mean, if you look at the behavior of union bigwigs and the sort of upper crust of the labor movement in advanced societies, advanced capitalist societies. However, I mean, that did not in any way change the sort of strategic outlook of Engels or Lenin, who still saw revolution in the heart of capitalism as absolutely necessary, sort of sine qua non for communist revolution worldwide. In fact, the sort of labor aristocrats were the ones who were perhaps the most vital to win over to the communist position. Because if that happens, I mean, it's game over, pretty much. And in fact, it depends. Like their behavior, obviously, like their behavior um, in Britain in the 1880s, which is when Engels coined that phrase, um, like it's quite different from the behavior of like the shop stewards in Germany in 1919. Like it tended to be like the most skilled sections and some of the union leadership of Germany that were the most revolutionary components of the German working class. Obviously, certain parts of the union leadership did shift over to the Eberts and the Noskis of the social democratic government of the Weimar Republic, which did play a very counter-revolutionary role. But again, it varies historically, and I think observing its existence like sociologically, empirically, does not relieve us of the responsibility of organizing these sections of the class in a. I mean, according to Marx, Engels, and Lenin, that is the task is to foment world revolution, to organize it in the core of capitalism, and across national lines, such that they're not siloed. And really, there needs to be an international. There needs to be class
Right.
independence, and there needs to be international coordination of workers, throughout the world. That hasn't
I mean,
existed for 100 years.
right. I mean, I had actually uh I remember when I was talking to Colin Bodell and I was like, I believe this about China when they call it new Comintern. BRICS is not a Comintern, and no world is BRICS a Comintern. Like, it's not even primarily with socialist countries.
Hmm.
It's an alternate trade bloc, which it might be good for it to exist if it was more formalized and a little bit, but That's not. It's not. It's not here to me to shit on bricks. I don't think it. I don't like. But you're not going to argue to me that contemporary Russia and India are somehow like crypto socialist states. So it just, to me, I see the dominance of this form of, for lack of a better term, Marxist-Leninism. I don't even think it's Marxist-Leninism, to be honest with you. Like it is removed from the historical justifications of Marx. It's an extension of it. You could argue that it is the honest answer to where Marxist-Leninism went, and after, let's say, the 1980s, because most of the other Marxist-Leninist movements have died on the vine. But it would be, even compared to other, like if you were to present this to the Naxalites or something, they would also find it very weird and strange.
Yeah, they oppose Beijing. They oppose Beijing
right,
straightforwardly.
Right. So it's just, it just seems to me to be, if I am honest, it seems to be to me to be a radicalization of a lot of the assumptions of social democrats. Given a more militant edge by inverting anti-communism. So that's where I would go with it. But you have to ignore so many divisions within. I mean, even like ignoring all the philosophical problems that we see with the historiographic treatment of Western Marxism and the entire problems of the category. Even if I accepted all that, I'd still be like, okay, but how do you deal with like the contradictions of Vietnam and Cambodia? Or how do you deal with the fact that you had different Marxist-Leninist parties fighting each other to death in Latin America and the Southeast Asia,
or Nepal too, like Nepal,
right? Yeah,
which is in the
like
news
right now,
recently.
yeah,
in the news, yeah, for sure.
I mean, how, this does not solve these problems for you, and to say acknowledging the problems is this historical nihilism, to me, the one thing I was sympathetic to in the Stalin the Black Legend book, because I do sometimes think we use Stalin to not deal with the problems of failure historically in the Soviet Union, right? Mm-hmm. Focusing on Stalin, the man misses that. But the thing is that Losurdo doesn't want to say it was a failure, and then I always go, well, then why, then why did Khrushchev happen? And then he's like, well, that's revisionism. And then I go like, okay, but you've said that things played out the way they played out because they had to play out that way. So how does this work? Right? I just don't know. It seems like it seems like special pleading from the philosophical assumptions one way or the other. And you start getting into intellectual knots. But most people haven't read all of Losurdo or thought it all through. If you in your first article on Losurdo for the New International, you mentioned the four things that John Bellamy Foster brings up. By themselves, those four concessions, I would actually agree those are problems that have happened.
Mm-hmm.
What he uses the conclusion that he uses that for, I would not join him. But I'm like, yes, we have seen a turn away from nature science. We have not dealt with imperialism, strongly. I mean, particularly in the social democratic turn after 2023. I mean, 2013. Sorry, I'm getting old enough that these decades are kind of consolidating in my head. Particularly after 2013. And, and there are contradictions in it today. You want to watch Marxist-Leninist fight? Mention who is Israel's number one trade partner. It's China. Yeah. It's not even the U.S. I mean, to be fair, China's a lot of people's number one trade partner, but
they just export so much more. Yeah.
Right. But it wouldn't even hurt China's bottom line to really stop trading with Israel, except that it wants particular technologies that the Israeli state has encouraged to be developed.
The states that are surveilling their own populations and looking to repress potential uprisings, of course they're going to be trading with Israel. That's Israel's #1 export.
Right.
That's why Arab states do business with Israel despite their official political line of not acknowledging its existence. Um, it's just they all are looking to gain access to these different repressive technologies.
But when you bring this up online, like people, you just see like oh, you don't understand economics. I'm like, actually I do. Israel's not a big enough trade partner for it to hurt China's bottom line. Just want to point that out to you. Like, that doesn't, if you say that there's no morality to trade, well, the USSR didn't practice that in that way. I'm not here to defend everything the USSR did, but they did not do that. Like,
yeah, they had the Comic-Con.
Right. So it just seems like you're getting yourself into all kinds of theoretical knots that even matter now. This is not just a question. You can go, okay, well, these are questions of the past, Varn. This is all from like the 1970s. I'm like, oh yeah, well, what do you think about this happening in 2025? Like, this does not answer this for you.
Yeah, I do. I agree with you too. Like there is a confluence. I mean, despite their own sort of stated antagonism towards each other, and the barbs that they'll throw each other's way, between like social democratic or democratic socialist movements in the global north and Marxist-Leninist ideology and the global south, in terms of their vision of what socialism actually positively is, there's very little space between them. They're only a hair removed from each other. I mean, it's really it's really aesthetics like that changes them, like in terms of like Marxist Leninist aesthetics. Yeah, more military parades, I suppose. But in terms of what they actually think that socialism is, it's about like reducing wealth inequality. It's about it's about building up different welfare state programs, social safety net, etc. Um, yeah, so the actual vision is not that different. There's very little left of, and again, this is all stuff that is one could trace to kind of pre-Marxian and then perhaps Lassallean socialism, like that views the ends of socialism as the buildup of the state, which is very
Mhm.
much what Losurdo was interested in, very much what democratic socialists are interested in. Um, it's raising taxes and whatnot. It's not fundamentally overcoming the contradiction within civil society the way that Marx and proletarian socialists, revolutionary proletarian socialists of the 19th and early 20th century were interested in. Yeah, so I mean, it's that vision of revolution that's kind of been lost, and despite despite the gulf that exists between them, otherwise, in terms of how they conceive of themselves, I think that they're almost identical. Contemporary Neo-Stalinism or Marxism-Leninism, and social democratic politics in the West. It's just a matter, I guess, like where it's taking place, and I guess the political means to achieve it. But even those aren't that different, practically speaking. And the geopolitics too. Like you're absolutely right, and I try to point this out too, like that, especially because one of the big things that Lacerda takes issue with in terms of like Marcuse and Bloch. He leaves out Sartre in this respect, though. I mean, you could throw him in too as their stance towards Israel. They were quite apologetic towards Israel in a way that obviously any illusions that they may have had about it in the 60s like should by now be well and truly buried. I mean, like
Mhm.
even the dream of a kind of liberal Zionism is just like it can't be maintained in the present day, just in light of everything that's happened since, but even in light of like what it originally was. But I mean, if you go like from the point that I make, is first of all that this stance was rather um, widely
It
held,
was
even amongst
it was a common
anti-imperialists.
form stance. Like,
Yeah, and I mean that again, like Stalin and the USSR, it was their material and ideological support for Israel in 1948 that's the only reason that Israel even won its independence war. Um, and then it was still held by like outspoken anti-imperialists like Leo Huberman, who was one of the co-founders, co-editors in chief of the Monthly Review, even into the 60s after the Six-Day War,
Yeah.
and all the way up to the present. Like in terms of China's continued trade that they do, their extensive trade that you just mentioned. Like, yeah, they hate when this is brought up, and of course they say they have all manner of excuses for it. But in light of like what is clearly, I mean, I think anyone with eyes to see should recognize as a genocide occurring um, in Gaza. Like, how you can justify continuing to trade with a state that's perpetrating that genocide is just absolutely beyond the pale.
Right. I mean, it's also like Losurdo does not deal with the fact that during the war on terror, China took the U.S.'s side for obvious domestic reasons. Like,
Yeah,
that's
and
a
that
fact. Like,
and it's out of the news now, but like all the stuff with the Uyghurs in Xinjiang, like very similar language to the war on terror that they were using.
mhm.
You know, in the aughts, like is very much the same rationale that they were using for the different re-education camps in that province. And again, to
Yeah,
me,
I
like
mean,
this is not contradictory because it's a capitalist state. Like it's just, I mean, despite its own ideological pretensions, like it's obviously a capitalist society and uh, you know represented by a capitalist state.
even if you were going to argue that, and sometimes I'll be like, yeah, I believe there's real socialists in the Chinese government. And it's not, I would even maybe defend that. But they are still operating, private firms that have produced tons of wealth. Yes, they've redistributed it, a lot of it down. Yes, they've done amazing things in the reduction of poverty. But at the same time, um, like the strengthening of like the Chinese social healthcare system is like, a recent reform that is not even to European standards. And when I hear, oh, they can't materially do that, I'm like, well, why not? Like that, China has a lot of wealth. It's undeniable. Even people who are very sympathetic to it, like the world system, school Marxist and whatnot, will tell you like they can't call it the periphery anymore. They'll come up with some new category for it, like semi-periphery or something like that. But
Mm-hmm.
they'll admit that. And you might argue, well, that's necessary for almost Plekhanoffian reasons. But then I'm like, but if that's true, then socialism in one country is like you had to do national developmentalism first, which in some ways actually means that the peasant revolutions still had to capitulate the capital. And that's your theory. So just own it. Just like say, like, okay, there needs to be a state capital period. Because Lenin did talk about that. I mean, like you could be a
Sure.
perfectly consistent Leninist and look at certain, I mean, Lenin wasn't always consistent, but like look at certain texts by Lenin and figure that out. Like and argue it. But that's not what's happening now. It's like more like, no, this is socialism. And I've even said, yeah, it's true that in the Dengist Constitution in 1982, China says it's reached the socialist stage. But if you listen to what every leader of the Chinese Communist Party has said since Xi Min, and definitely in Hu Jintao and Xi, is that we have not hit the necessary socialist reforms to achieve socialism until like some unstated date in the future. I think currently it's like 2050.
2050,
But
yeah, they're
yeah, but it
gonna
keeps
hit
on
the
getting
hit
moved
the
back.
communism button. Yeah,
Right.
and that's gonna happen. I mean, and different leaders have you know proposed different dates in the past. Stalin himself in 1936 claimed that class antagonism had been effectively overcome
Mm-hmm.
within the boundaries of the USSR. Obviously, Khrushchev tried to say that the dictatorship of the proletariat was outmoded, and that because the proletariat itself had become attenuated, now it was the state of all people. Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
all the different twists and turns of different official policy by the Chinese Communist Party. Yeah, they're gonna keep kicking the can down the road. I mean, maybe they'll prove us wrong. Maybe in 25 years, China will be a fully realized communist society. I I'm skeptical. I just don't think it's going to happen. I think that's inconsistent with obvious. I believe it's first of all inconsistent with what Marx, Engels, and Lenin thought. But even beyond that, I just don't think it's. I think the reason why they thought it is because it's practically impossible. It just can't happen. Communism is not nationally bounded. And I don't think that the necessary prerequisites for it socially. I don't think that any state possesses sufficient resources, even
Mhm.
a vast, highly populated state like China. I don't think that it possesses the resources that it can, to realize, you know, communist relations within its own state boundaries. So,
No, I mean it
like,
has to trade with non-communist states. Like, you
exactly.
know, yeah, like as I've told people, before, I'm like China can control its own, can control out of its own billionaires, but um, to a certain degree, but it can't tell the international bond market what to do. It can't tell international forex accounts what to do.
Hmm.
Um, and it has disproportionate sway there. That is not. There's no. I am not denying that, but you know, China has not been able to go to the IMF, for example, and just like, you will do what we say. That they neither want to nor have the capacity to.
Yeah.
And you know,
And if there's a crisis in the world capitalist market, it's going to have ripple effects in China. There are going to be layoffs. There's going to be Chinese businesses put out of business. Because
well,
I mean, it's
Chinese GDP growth has been stagnating for a decade.
that
Like,
that too. That too. I
like,
mean, that's something that the China stands really are struggling to come to grips with. They haven't really produced, and I think honestly, like I think that they're whatever advantages might be claimed for their handling of the coronavirus epidemic, like it really had pretty disastrous economic consequences in the different places
absolutely.
that were really shut down. That's like just clear. I think that the figures that like the picture hasn't fully emerged from that yet, but I think that it's going to bear it out that that really had disastrous economic impacts.
I would also say that, like, another thing that I would say that I see is, like, China has seen some growth advantage recently because of the United States self-imposed tariff regime, but again, that is from the actions of another country, and
Yeah.
ones that I don't find particularly economically rational, but nonetheless, I mean, I can. Um, but yet, being the global hegemon in the capitalist market, because the Western capitalism has degraded so much, is not actually an argument that you are socialist. So it's a
Sure.
strange, like I have responded to people in ways I'm like, yeah, I think as far as like international actors go, China is a responsible international actor on the world stage, barring what I've said about their trade with Israel and the current Palestine situation. But like, in general, they're pretty responsible, way more responsible than a lot of Western powers. But Western powers have been responsible in the past. You're basically just saying that, like, the standards of, like, when the West had a stronger state during, like, the Fordist Compact and after World War II. I mean, are you going to argue that that was a nascent form of communism? Because that's basically what you're arguing is good. Um, so
Yeah, and I think that some of the contradictions that have maybe been papered over um, in light of the recent trade war stuff. So
mhm,
like the much publicized meeting in India between Modi and Putin and Xi, like the whole BRICS thing that the tariff policies of the US have kind of served to bolster in a lot of ways. I still think
mhm.
that like regardless of that, like there are still there's a rivalry between India and China that's not going away anytime soon.
Right.
Um I think Russia, its own it's largely a marriage of convenience. Given the war in Ukraine, like Western Europe is no longer the main consumer of its natural gas and oil exports. So
Mhm.
it's found in markets in China and India, but that war's not going to go on forever. I mean, these kinds of relations aren't not going to last forever. I mean, even it even looked like, especially when Trump announced the tariffs, like initially, um, like Vietnam, which had over the last like 30, 40 years has been much closer to the US than to China. There was the first time the first time a Chinese premier has gone to Vietnam
Yeah, absolutely.
in decades. Again, I still think that Vietnam fears China's if not a sort of aspiring global hegemon, then certainly the de facto regional hegemon of the South China Sea and um, just that in all of East Asia and Southeast Asia. Like, that's these antagonisms aren't going away anytime soon. So, we'll see how we'll see how the balance of trade shakes out, I guess, with the tariff regime, which I've been following your recent radical engagements with Jimmy Merchant's texts, which have been
Mhm.
great. Um, yeah, very passionately enforced. Like, it's unclear how coherently they'll be maintained once they do stabilize. But yeah,
Mhm. Well, I mean, I think we're in a period of global instability of which China will probably be one of the more stabilizing factors. But again,
yeah,
that's not the same as me saying like China is the model for global communism. It's just me saying that like they're a relatively responsible actor on the international stage because uh their bourgeois interests are somewhat curtailed, but they still have a fair amount of profitability, even though their GDP has been declining. If that continues to decline, I do not know what that'll look like. And they're like, "Oh, well, Varn, why do you assume it's going to continue to decline?" And I'm like, "Well, no developed economy in the world has maintained high levels of GDP growth above 5% after a certain level of development, and we've
yeah.
seen
After
that." And
industrialization, yeah, after
right,
industrialization, it drops off. After proletarianization, like takes hold, it is generalized across society, then the kind of like off the charts growth that one experience like that you saw in the 19th century in Britain and in parts of in the North in the United
in the
States.
1980s and 1990s in China, that just
Yeah,
falls to the floor, like
yeah,
so, and it has been, and
yeah,
that doesn't mean that they're mishandling their economy. It's just it acts like a capitalist economy, like
yeah.
um,
They can be very rational actors in contemporary geopolitics. They can be very rational economic actors within the global capitalist economy, but that's what they're part of.
right,
And what's required, you know, according to Marx, Engels, and Lenin, I whatever else might have changed in terms of like the constitution of contemporary capitalism, I think that these fundamentals remain the same. Like a coordinated, um, if not simultaneous, then at least breaking out in rapid succession, a coordinated international proletarian revolution in the heart of capitalism, which, in the 19th century would have been, Britain, the United States, Germany, and France. Today would include Russia, Japan, China, perhaps Brazil. Like a coordinated working class, power in these different regional centers. That's what's required to really shepherd the transition from the global capitalist economy toward a fully socialized society. And nothing, you know, no new trade deals on the part of, you know, various states, whether they fly a red flag or not, is going to move in that direction without that kind of um, basic political, class independent movement um, along international lines.
yeah. Well, on that note, I think that's a good place to stop. We've been talking for about 2 hours. Where can people find your work, Ross?
So I've been published in the Brooklyn Rail. I'm doing this work with New International Mag. I've got some pieces coming out for the New York Review of Architecture, writing on architecture, architectural review. Um, yeah, so find my work there. Yeah, I should put you in touch with Jamie Merchant. You guys should definitely talk tariffs.
Okay, yeah, we'd love to. All right.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much.